Well, hello, I'm Neil Grigg, and I'm in the Department of Civil Engineering at Colorado State University. And this session is going to be about conflicts and diplomacy in water resources. I'm a professor in the Department of Civil Engineering, as I mentioned, and normally you would think of that as technical engineering department, which it is, but over the years, as I've worked in water resources in many different situations, I've found that conflicts block solutions more than technical issues do. So in this session and in another one, I want to focus on the nature of these conflicts, why they block integrated management, and what we can do about it. So the dilemma is that water resources involve a lot of interconnected issues. There are two attributes of water which are unique among complex systems. One is there's so many demands on water for so many different uses that we inevitably come into conflicts about the use of water. The second aspect of water, which is unique, is that it travels from one group of people to another as it moves through the hydrologic cycle. So it's like we're interconnected even if we don't want to be. So when you think about human nature and the nature of business and organizations and what might cause some of the problems that we have with conflicts, you can see that there are two types of issues that really block solutions. The first is self-interest. We're all working toward our own interests, whether financial or our value systems or whatever, and so we'll take the actions that seem to make more sense to us. The other is organizational self-interest, in the sense that organizations have power structures and incentives that cause them to act in their own interest rather than in the community interest. The other aspect of water is what you might even think about as a type of government failure. We have stovepipes between the different levels of government and between governments at the same level, like county and city governments. They don't line up with watersheds. There are a lot of governmental problems that block integrated solutions. So when you think about the integrated water management and the nature of these conflicts, it's natural to go right away to the watershed as a place where you can see these many different aspects of water management coming together. As I mentioned, these different types of demands on water, you can see those in a diagram of a watershed where there's conflicts between cities and farms and recreational uses of water and so on. And then think about upstream and downstream conflicts, and pretty soon you get the picture. These are sort of age-old dilemmas, and in fact this diagram goes back to the 1950s as a way to explain to people what's going on with water conflicts. So when we are looking at why we have to integrate our management and how we really need to resolve conflicts, you can see all these different demands on water, which you've been hearing about in this course already. Water scarcity, water for food, health issues, environmental needs for water, habitats, and even disasters, where one aspect of water management will turn around and either lead to a disaster like a dam failure, or it may, the disaster aspect may block the other uses of it. So the coordination required for all of these is very complex, as you can imagine. So what happens is that these conflicts happen, and they require solutions through what we call governance. Now, governance sounds like government, but it means something else, and you're supposed to have in the course here a special session on governance where it will be explained in more detail. To me, it's the operations of government as government goes about resolving conflicts, managing resources, and solving problems in different ways. So with water management, a number of issues come to fore. One is allocating resources and water resources. That's probably one of the major conflict arenas. But you also have conflicts that arise between what government does in the public sector and what the private sector can do, such as an industry or a business of any kind that needs water. And I already mentioned that water is unique and essential to all of our uses. So to come up with systems that can help us solve all of these different problems, we have to have ways to value water. That's another source of difficulty, because people see different value systems when they try to give their opinion on how to allocate water resources. So integration is needed. It really boils down to effective coordination among all of these different demands and uses. How to do that coordination in the face of market failure and government failure. And by the way, there's a field called public choice, which has come about in an attempt to bridge the gap between market failure and government failure, and to be realistic about how government officials and private business people operate and make decisions as they go along. So the challenge is how to do it. And this is a formidable challenge, as you can imagine, and we'll talk a little about that in this session and in the next one. So to review that, the conflicts are those that are the reasons that we have problems. They're more serious than science or technical solutions. Even money sometimes can't unblock these conflicts that we got. The conflicts are widespread. They occur from small settings like that watershed I showed to larger settings like river basins or even nations. And the solution should be effective water governance, but we don't know how to do that yet, and we need to figure it out. So I mentioned that governance is the actions of government to employ the process of governing to solve human needs. But a more detailed definition is that governance involves the authority to manage water affairs as it is applied to the sector of water resources. Now, governance is going to be applied in every sector of human endeavor. So what we're talking about is applying it in the category of water affairs. And then for a longer definition of it, you see there a quote from the Global Water Partnership where they say that governance involves a range of political, social, economic, and administrative systems to develop and manage water resources and water services at different levels of society. I find long definitions like that to be hard to work with, because you try to wrap so many concepts into one definition, you sort of lose sight of the big picture. But the bottom line is that in a lot of places, this governance is not working well. And at the bottom, I have another quote, this time from the World Water Assessment Program, which is part of the United Nations or UNESCO system. In many countries, water governance is in a state of confusion. And you can imagine how that would be the case when you look at a lot of political difficulties of different kinds in countries around the world. It's a miracle that we can manage water even at a basic level, but it's essential to solve that problem and bridge the gaps that are there. So I want to give you a few examples. When we talk about governance and integrated water management and conflicts, these are all abstract concepts, and we need to look at examples in order to see how it really plays out. And one example is the Colorado River, which is famous in the western part of the United States as needing governance, but also involving many conflicts. So I have two maps here. The top one, a geophysical map, where you can get an idea of the aridity and the elevation in the western part of the United States, and then where the rivers drain on the bottom. And you can see that the Colorado River drains the southwestern part of the United States, 7 states more or less, and then into Mexico. And when you think about the dependence of that part of the country on that river, you get an idea of how critical it is that we can resolve those conflicts and manage the river. So what you're going to see on the Colorado River is conflicts between water users, conflicts between the different states, and even conflicts between the United States as a nation and Mexico as a nation. And I don't think I mentioned conflicts between value systems of these different uses, but it's quite, as you can imagine, quite a long story about the conflicts on the Colorado River and how these mechanisms of governance and conflict resolution have been implemented to try to resolve them. Here's another map of the Colorado River basin. It's got a little more detail in it. I just wanted to show this one to illustrate some of the features of the river and some of the aspects of the conflict resolution. It even comes into play up in the part of the basin where we live. Here, if you can see the cursor of the computer up near Fort Collins, and then in Denver here, we have large interbasin transfers of water out of the upper Colorado River before the water even starts to flow downstream. And then you have a group of states that are referred to as the upper basin states, and then others lower basin states. And then we have a dividing point with a boundary reservoir, which is one of the concepts and infrastructure systems that are usually necessary to help resolve these different conflicts there. In the upper right here, you can see a recent study done by a U.S. federal agency, the Bureau of Reclamation, to try to quantify some of the issues. You can imagine that with the water having been divided in the past between the upper basin and lower basin states, if you have climate change and less water in some areas and in the past, how that's going to make the controversies a lot worse. So the bottom line on conflict resolution and governance is that what has evolved is something called the law of the river, which is very complex, but in order to see how the Colorado River is actually managed, you'd have to look at the whole law of the river. So the Colorado River example is one. You'll hear that discussed a lot in other sections of the course. But globally, we have many issues which are similar to that. Competition between the people, the water uses or areas, and you need the laws and the rules, like the law of the river on the Colorado. But these laws and rules don't cross national boundaries or even state boundaries easily, which exacerbates the conflicts and means that we really don't have good ways to resolve those conflicts other than some kind of a formal mechanism like a court case. So when we think about how to classify these different issues, they'll fall into categories so that we can understand them and not necessarily have to look at every case all over the world and think that it's something unique. They involve local watersheds with varied sizes with a lot of different types of conflicts, boating versus fishing, use of water for irrigation, keeping the reservoir empty for flood control, many issues like that. Then you can have larger scale systems like a regional river basin. You can have upstream, downstream types of issues, and I'll give you a couple of examples of those. And then you can have larger scale transboundary issues where the water issues transfer across basins from one state to another. Well, actually, that would be the transboundary across jurisdictions. The ones where you transfer water from one basin to another, we're going to look at that as an interbasin issue, interbasin transfer conflict, as being a different type of an issue than when the water flows across a state line or a national boundary. So looking at those in the local watersheds, there are a lot of resources for this. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has developed a tremendous resource to explain local watershed types of problems, and I use this extensively in my course, trying to explain what's going on with watersheds and all the many different issues that have to be confronted if we're going to get some solutions there. This graphic that you see here shows the watershed. Hydrologically, you can define what a watershed is. You can look at what the issues are there. Well, to make a long story short, watershed management is a field of study and knowledge which is really essential to begin to resolve the conflicts at the local level in places like the watershed shown. Then when you scale that up to a river basin, which might be larger, like at a regional scale, we could go over, for example, to Australia and look at the famous river basin called Murray-Darling. It drains down toward Adelaide, as you can see, drains some of the most important parts of Australia, the southeastern part where the seat of government is and a lot of the economic activity is. And what they found in recent years is that the river had been over-allocated. You can actually see that in the hydrographs that you see that go from earlier times to current times here. I don't have enough time to explain that in detail, but what you would see is that the demands on water have been growing, and that the supply of water has actually been going down recently with a lot of drought, and with the net result of there being just a lot of conflicts that weren't resolved. So Australia put into place a new group of water policies. They created water markets that they hadn't had before, and in many ways they've revolutionized water management to come to grips with these shortages and problems that have occurred. Here's another river basin, international. The one on the Murray-Darling was a national case, but it went from one state to another. But at the international level, like the Mekong River Basin, you can have a different scale of problems. This map shows how the Mekong starts up in China, flows down through Laos and Thailand, Cambodia, and eventually down into the Vietnam area where you have the Mekong Delta there. And as a mechanism to try to resolve the conflicts on the Mekong, there's been an institution in operation since in late 1940s, I believe. It's called the Mekong River Commission. You see a picture of their council, their governing council, and that's an attempt to use a governance mechanism to resolve the conflicts on the large river basin. As you can imagine, it's not entirely successful, but at least it's a start to resolve these conflicts. Here's one which I use in my class in water resources management to explain some social issues and conflicts that turned out to be so difficult that they actually created some political developments that were unknown to me in the past. This is the San Francisco River Basin, which in Brazil, the river flows from south to north. The south part of the river basin is a highly industrialized, populated region, rich region of Brazil, and where it flows into the sea in the north is a poorer, drier region. So you can imagine trying to come to grips with the disparities between the value systems of these different parts would be difficult for them. Many conflicts, many issues, especially social justice. Credit for this case study and the information goes to one of our graduates from Colorado State, Gerson Kilman, who actually became the director of the National Water Agency in Brazil and has explained this case study to us. So the case study involved a hunger strike by a Catholic priest who was fighting for social justice as he understood it. And it reached the top level of the president of the country with this hunger strike. Basically, it was about a proposed interbasin transfer of water out of the basin, and it continues even as we speak as a national priority to try to find a solution to it. Famous around the world, of course, is the Nile River because of all of the pictures that you see, the many different stories that come out of Africa, and have a lot of information on it. And in the next session, I'll explain that in a little more detail. But here you see the map of the Nile River. You see the headwaters of the White Nile that are down on the bottom of the picture. The river flows from south to north. So the river system on the bottom is called the White Nile. It flows out of the Lake Victoria region from Tanzania and Uganda, Kenya, and those countries to the north through a great swamp into Sudan, and then it's joined by the Blue Nile, which starts in Ethiopia. The two together form the Nile River, which flows into Egypt and Egypt, especially with its large population and many issues, depends so much on the Nile River. And it's a long story, but you can imagine the many conflicts that have developed and continue to require a lot of attention for resolution. So another large-scale river system like those I've just discussed, very famous, is Brahmaputra-Ganges system. Here the waters are shared by China, India, and Bangladesh. You can see the Brahmaputra system here flowing through China and then down into Bangladesh and India. You can see the Ganges system coming in over here, coming together, and you can imagine all the conflicts that come about in trying to provide for the quality of life and environment in this large river system. China, with its growing population, wanting to tap the upper reaches of the Brahmaputra. Bangladesh needing the water resources for irrigation during the dry season, but also being concerned about the large flooding during the wet season, the monsoon season. India considering the Ganges and others to be like a holy river, having special spiritual qualities, and needing to enter into compacts and agreements with those other countries. And just like the Nile River and the Colorado River, you can go back and study the history of this river system, and you'll find many things that have occurred over the centuries to work those problems out. So just to wrap this session up, the big picture is that it's very difficult to allocate the resources provided by water either through market mechanisms or government, the state. So you have many scenarios of conflicts, from the smallest scenarios to the largest scale problems, a lot of different stakeholder groups. And the conflicts are just inevitable, but what's lacking with water conflicts is conflict resolution mechanisms. And often special interests who are powerful can roll over our attempts to create integrated solutions. But in the end, the only thing that works for everybody is integrated solutions which are based on effective governance. That's why when I started this session, I said that whereas technical approaches are necessary, you're not going to be able to come to full solutions to these problems without effective governance. I explained a little of what governance is, and you'll hear more about it in other sessions of this course. Now, this is a little block diagram which I've created in a simple way to explain what's involved with water governance, where you've got to have fundamental institutions that undergird your system, like the rule of law, and then you go through the different aspects of governance if you're going to have outcomes that work for everyone. And I explained how you have different scales where water conflicts play out. In the simplest case, you have few issues, few governments involved, and you might have some kind of a problem like a single jurisdiction municipal water supply that can be worked out. But as you carry the complexity ahead, involving more governance, more governments with greater institutional complexity, then you have more issues, technically speaking. You get into large-scale problems like those river basins that I mentioned, and then we can look at others too, like the Danube and the Rhine in Europe, or the Great Lakes, United States and Canada. There. So what I'll talk about next is two common scenarios. One, the interbasin transfer, where we're moving water from one basin to another, usually permanently. And the second, where water flows across some kind of a governmental jurisdictional boundary, where you need some kind of an agreement where things can be worked out. So thank you for listening, and you'll see me again in the next session soon.